Women just don't have the head for this kind of thing, Richard said, leaning back in his chair with a self-satisfied grin, as if he'd just cracked some universal code. He laced his hands behind his head, exuding the smugness of a man convinced of his own wisdom. It's not personal, Sandra. Finance is a high-pressure game. Kevin's the natural choice here. I sat across from him, my jaw tight, staring down at the spreadsheet spread neatly in front of me, the one I'd spent countless late nights perfecting. My hands itched to ball it up and hurl it across the room, but I forced myself to sit still, every muscle locked in place. Measured. Richard, I said, keeping my voice steady. I've managed multi-million-dollar portfolios for 6 years. My team's performance is consistently in the top 5 across the region. I know what I'm doing. He waved a hand dismissively, as if brushing away a fly. I'm sure you're great in your department, Sandra, but this is family. We need someone who understands our values, our goals. Kevin gets what's at stake. Kevin, sitting beside him, could barely contain his glee. He wore the look of a man who'd found a winning lottery ticket, grinning ear to ear. 24, fresh out of business school, with a brand new suit and the kind of confidence only inherited privilege can buy. I'd be willing to bet he'd never balanced a checkbook, let alone managed real money. But with Richard's last name, suddenly he was the second coming of Warren Buffett. I turned to Kevin, more irritated by his cocky smile than his lack of experience. So, Kevin, what's your approach for the portfolio? What's your first move? My words were even, but I couldn't keep the edge from creeping in. He blinked, caught off guard, and stammered. Well, I was thinking I'd start with some high-growth tech stocks. Ride the wave, you know. Richard nodded, satisfied, as if Kevin had just revealed a masterstroke. Exactly. That's the kind of bold thinking we need. Big moves. My heart sank. Bold moves. That was their grand plan. I'd dedicated years to unraveling the complexities of the market, scrutinizing risk and reward, building diversified portfolios that weathered storms and thrived in calm. To be sidelined in favor of reckless enthusiasm, it was infuriating. My name is Sandra. For as long as I can remember, I've had to prove myself in rooms full of men who saw me as an anomaly. In my world, being underestimated is routine. You learn to expect it, to steel yourself against the constant undercurrent of doubt. But this was different. This wasn't some anonymous colleague or a skeptical client. This was my own family, my stepfather, choosing my stepbrother over me. Kevin had no track record, no credentials, no real plan. His only qualification was sharing Richard's name. I'd entered Richard's family at 12, after my mother remarried. Back then, Richard was stern but even-handed. He'd made a point of treating Kevin and me as equals. At least that was how it used to be. Over time, though, his favoritism grew more obvious, until it was impossible to ignore. The family portfolio wasn't just a side project. It was our future. I'd poured weeks into analyzing the numbers, crafting a plan to protect our assets and grow them steadily. But none of it mattered. Richard's decision had nothing to do with skill or experience. His mind was made up long before I entered the room. Driving home that night, fury simmered in my chest. It's not personal. That's what he'd said. But how could it not be? I'd built a career in a field where I was dismissed before I even opened my mouth, fighting for every scrap of respect. To have my own family ignore everything I'd achieved, to see them hand my work to a novice simply because he was a man, it stung in a way I hadn't expected. When I got home, Mike was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. He looked up the moment I walked in, his face lighting up with a smile that faded when he saw my expression. How'd it go? I dropped my bag on the counter and let out a long breath. It was a disaster. Richard gave the portfolio to Kevin. According to him, women aren't cut out for finance. Mike's jaw tightened as he set down his knife. He actually said that. Out loud. I poured myself a glass of water, trying to steady my nerves. Word for word. And Kevin just sat there, looking like he'd already made his first million. Mike shook his head in disbelief. That's absurd. You've been running circles around guys like Kevin for years. He probably thinks a balance sheet is a yoga pose. I barked out a bitter laugh. Exactly. But it doesn't matter. Richard sees me as a liability and Kevin as an asset, even though the numbers say otherwise. It's like I'm invisible, no matter what I do. That night, staring up at the ceiling in the dark, my mind spun with frustration and hurt. But beneath it all, a stubborn resolve took root. I was done trying to win Richard's approval. I'd spent years letting other people's opinions define my value, always feeling like I had to work twice as hard just to stand on the same ground. No more. My track record spoke for itself. My firm's portfolio was on fire, and I was in talks to lead a major project that could put my whole team in the spotlight. If Richard wanted to believe Kevin was a prodigy, let him. In a year, the numbers would tell the real story. Results don't care about last names. For now, I would step back and let them make their mistakes. I wouldn't waste another ounce of energy trying to change Richard's mind. Instead, I'd focus on what I could control. My own work, my own reputation. I'd let my results speak for themselves, louder than any argument I could make. And maybe, just maybe, when the dust settled, Richard would have to face the truth. The weeks that followed were harder than I'd expected. Every time Kevin posted some vague, self-congratulatory update about crushing it in finance, or Richard praised Kevin's bold vision, my stomach churned. The unfairness of it all was almost too much to bear. But I forced myself to keep my head down, pouring every ounce of energy into my new project at work. The stakes were higher than ever. This portfolio was high profile, the kind of opportunity I'd dreamed about for years. I threw myself into market research, strategy calls, late nights with my team. Instead of letting the bitterness eat away at me, I channeled it into my work, determined to make this project a success. And as the days turned into weeks, something shifted. My anger became fuel, driving me to push harder, think smarter, lead better. My team rallied around me, and together we started to see real, tangible results. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of pride that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. I'd been forced to watch my stepbrother stumble through decisions he barely understood, cheered on by a man who refused to see my worth. But I'd also rediscovered something I'd almost lost, the conviction that I didn't need anyone's permission to succeed. The world could underestimate me all it wanted. I was done waiting for recognition. I'd build my own legacy, brick by brick, and let the work speak for itself. And when the time came, I wouldn't need to say a word. The truth, cold, indisputable, and written in black and white, would be impossible to ignore. Late nights at the office gradually became my new normal, almost a second home, with a hum of fluorescent lights and the soft glow of spreadsheets keeping me company long after dusk. I was knee-deep in data, running endless projections until my eyes blurred and the numbers started to dance on the screen. Frankly, though, I thrived on it. There was a quiet thrill in building a portfolio that was both innovative and solid, balancing risk and reward, weaving together disparate investments into something cohesive and resilient. Every model, every scenario I played out, felt like I was painting a masterpiece, one brushstroke at a time, except my canvas was the market and my paints were numbers and trends. It was well past 10 one evening when Laura, my mentor, confidant, and the sharpest analyst I knew, wandered over. She leaned against my desk, arms crossed, her expression a blend of amusement and admiration. "You're really going all in on this one, aren't you?" she said, her tone teasing but warm. I smiled, feeling the fatigue in my bones but also the stubborn spark that kept me going. "It feels personal," I admitted, letting the words hang in the air. She cocked an eyebrow, instantly reading between the lines. "The client." I shook my head, the memory still raw. "My stepfather. He handed the family portfolio over to my stepbrother. Said women aren't cut out for finance." Laura's eyes widened with disbelief. "He actually said that? Out loud?" "Yep." The word tasted bitter, even after all this time. She shook her head, her mouth set in a thin line. "Well, I hope he's ready to eat those words." In that moment something crystallized inside me. I decided with more clarity than ever that I was going to prove him wrong. Not just for me, but for every woman who'd been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated in the boys' club of finance. At home, the picture Richard painted about Kevin's investment prowess began to crack around the edges. Family dinners became awkward affairs, with Richard's updates about Kevin's supposed genius growing vaguer by the week. What once were boasts about double-digit returns and market-beating strategies turned into muttered phrases about long-term vision and strategic patience. One evening, as we gathered around the dinner table, I decided to poke the bear. "So how's the portfolio doing?" I asked, feigning casual interest. Richard shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "It's a long-term strategy," he replied, as if that explained everything. "Long-term," I repeated, arching an eyebrow. "That's usually code for, it's not working right now. What's he investing in, exactly?" Richard's jaw tightened, irritation flashing in his eyes. "It's none of your concern, Sandra. Kevin has it under control." I let it go, but inside I felt a grim satisfaction. I'd seen this pattern countless times. Overconfident investors chasing hot stocks, betting big on trends they didn't understand, ignoring fundamentals. Never ended well. The line between calculated risk and reckless gambling was razor thin, and I could sense which side Kevin was sliding toward. Meanwhile, my work life was moving in a completely different direction. The portfolio I managed for the firm was outperforming expectations quarter after quarter. Clients were ecstatic, emails of praise flooding my inbox. The numbers spoke for themselves, and soon word spread beyond just our office. I was invited to present my strategy at a regional finance conference, an honor that, only a year ago, would have seemed out of reach. It was the kind of recognition that could transform a career, opening doors to bigger projects, more responsibility, and industry respect. Laura was elated. "This is your moment," she told me, her eyes shining with pride. "Make it count. Show them what you're made of." The night before the conference, I stood in front of my mirror, rehearsing my presentation until my voice was hoarse. I thought about Richard and Kevin, about all the times I'd been dismissed, told to stay in my lane. Part of me wanted to send them an invitation just to see their faces when I took the stage, but I resisted. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about proving to myself and everyone else in the industry that I belonged here, that I could not only compete but excel. As the months rolled by, the gap between Kevin's results and mine widened into a chasm. My firm's portfolio kept climbing, each quarterly report better than the last. Clients began referring friends and colleagues, and my name started circulating in industry circles as someone to watch. At family gatherings, Richard's comments shifted from vague optimism to subtle hints of trouble, references to market volatility and unforeseen challenges. The bravado was slipping. Eventually the truth surfaced. One evening, as we passed around dessert, Richard let out a heavy sigh, the weight of disappointment etched on his face. "It's been a rough quarter," he admitted. "Kevin's portfolio has taken some hits." I looked up from my plate, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Hits? What kind of hits?" Richard hesitated, clearly reluctant. "Nothing catastrophic, just some setbacks." Kevin, who'd been silent the whole evening, finally spoke up, his voice defensive. "It's a tough market right now. No one's seeing big returns." "That's not true," I replied before I could stop myself. "Plenty of portfolios are thriving if they're managed well." The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Richard shot me a glare, his pride wounded. "Not everyone has the luxury of working with institutional clients, Sandra. Family portfolios are a different animal." I nodded, holding back the retort on the tip of my tongue. Let them think what they wanted. I didn't need to justify myself. Not when my results spoke louder than any argument. By the end of the year, there was no denying the reality. Kevin's portfolio was in freefall, battered by bad bets and unchecked confidence. Meanwhile, my firm's success was making headlines, our returns highlighted in industry publications. I was named one of the region's top financial analysts, Invited to an awards gala for innovative portfolio management. A moment that felt surreal and richly deserved after all the nights I'd poured into my work. Standing on stage, plaque in hand, I took in the applause and flashing cameras. For a moment, I let myself imagine Richard and Kevin watching, realizing just how wrong they'd been. They weren't there, of course, but I knew word would reach them. In this industry, reputation traveled fast. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, Richard called. His tone was different, stripped of arrogance, almost tentative. "Sandra, I saw your name in the Financial Times. Congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, keeping my voice even. There was a pause, as if he were searching for the right words. "I had no idea your firm was doing so well," he said at last. "I suppose I underestimated you." "You did," I agreed, but there was no malice in my voice. "But it means a lot to hear you say that." The real twist came later. Richard, always the self-proclaimed finance expert in the family, constantly quoting articles, glued to the financial news, found himself watching my firm's results featured live on Market Watch. I only heard about it because my husband, Mike, called me after work, laughter in his voice. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Richard's glued to the TV. Your firm's results are on Market Watch right now. They even mentioned you by name." It was a full-circle moment, a quiet vindication. I realized then that all the late nights, all the obstacles, all the times I'd been told to step aside had led me here. Not just to a place of professional success, but to a deeper sense of confidence. I'd proven to the world, and most importantly to myself, that I was more than capable, no matter who tried to stand in my way. Name. I froze, the weight of his words sinking in, memories of late nights and relentless effort flooding back. "What did they say?" "They called you one of the top-performing portfolio managers in the region." Mike's voice was steady, but Richard, usually loud, usually quick to offer an opinion, had been silent for the last 20 minutes. Inside me, pride and anticipation tangled like electricity. For months, I'd been grinding away, pushing through resistance, hitting milestones that Richard had always called impossible or a fluke. Now, the proof was undeniable. My name, my work, broadcast on national television for everyone, including Richard, to see. The next morning arrived with a strange quiet. The phone rang, Richard's name on the screen. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than I'd ever heard. "Sandra," he began, his words careful, "I saw the segment on Market Watch last night. I had no idea your firm was doing so well." The silence that followed stretched, almost as if he was waiting for me to fill it. I let him wait, savoring the reversal. "Thank you," I finally replied. "We've been working hard. It's been a team effort, but I'm proud of what we've built." He hesitated, then let out a long, measured sigh. "I have to admit I misjudged you. Your results are impressive." The words seemed to cost him something. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a deep rush of satisfaction. Vindication, yes, but also relief. "I appreciate that," I said, keeping my tone even. "But it's not about the recognition. It's about making smart, informed decisions. Consistently. That's what I've always aimed for." Richard didn't answer right away. There was a vulnerability in the silence that I'd never sensed before. Finally he spoke, voice rougher. "Do you have time to come by this weekend? I'd like to talk. There are some things I think you should see." Saturday arrived gray and cool, the kind of day that seemed suspended between seasons. When I arrived at his house, Richard opened the door without his usual bravado. No jokes, no bluster. The absence of Kevin was immediate and telling. We moved to the living room, the hush between us thick with things unsaid. Richard cleared his throat and handed me a folder, his hands trembling slightly. "These are the latest figures from the family portfolio," he said quietly. "I thought you might want to take a look." I opened the folder, flipping through the pages. The numbers were stark, worse than I'd expected. Losses accumulated, red ink bleeding across the printouts. A few high-risk investments had imploded, wiping out a significant chunk of the portfolio. Years of careful planning, undone by a handful of reckless decisions. It was the opposite of the diversified, balanced strategies I'd been building for my clients. The juxtaposition was painful. Kevin told me it was just market volatility, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. But after seeing your results, I'm starting to think it's something else. His admission hung in the air, heavy with regret. It's not just the market, I replied, choosing my words with care. It's the decisions being made, the lack of discipline, the absence of a coherent strategy. Managing a portfolio isn't about swinging for the fences every time. It's about understanding risk, knowing when to act and when to hold back, and building a foundation that can weather storms. Richard nodded, the gesture slow, weighted. I thought I was doing right by the family, giving Kevin control, letting him prove himself. Maybe I was trying to give him the chance I never had. But I underestimated you. And I overestimated him. His gaze dropped, the admission raw and honest. Hearing that from Richard, after years of being dismissed, having my experience discounted, felt surreal. For so long he'd brushed aside my expertise, refused to acknowledge my value. Now, sitting across from him, I saw something new: regret, humility, and a willingness to change. I owe you an apology, Sandra, he said, voice thick with emotion. I let my biases cloud my judgment. You've worked relentlessly, and I didn't give you the credit you deserved. That was wrong of me. For a moment I struggled for words. This was the vindication I'd craved for years, but it came with a bittersweet edge. Thank you, I said at last. I appreciate it. But this isn't about me. It's about what's best for the family. If we want the portfolio to recover, we need to make real, meaningful changes. Starting now. Richard nodded, his expression shifting from remorse to resolve. I want you to take over if you're willing. I trust you to do what's right. The hour that followed was filled with analysis and strategy. I walked Richard through a plan. Cut the losses, reallocate into safer instruments, rebalance the entire approach. I explained each move, the rationale behind every recommendation, and how patience and discipline would be our most important assets in the months ahead. As I spoke, I could see Richard absorbing every word, his skepticism replaced by genuine respect. It was a shift I'd never expected to see. When we finished, Richard leaned back, letting out a long, relieved breath. Sandra, I don't know how to thank you. You didn't have to do this. Not after how I treated you. But you did. That says a lot about who you are. I smiled, feeling a sense of closure and a release of old tension. It's not about proving a point, I said gently. It's about doing what's right, for the family, for everyone who counts on us. That's always been my priority. In the days that followed, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel a surge of frustration or resentment at the thought of Richard. He'd finally seen me, not just as a financial professional, but as an equal, as someone worthy of trust and respect. The old wounds weren't erased, but they felt less raw, the edges softened by the possibility of real change. At the next family dinner, the usual tension that always hovered around money and decisions was gone. Conversation flowed more easily, and when Richard brought up the new strategy, he did it without defensiveness or sarcasm. Sandra's got the portfolio back on track, he said, meeting my eyes across the table. I should have listened sooner. Kevin shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, avoiding my gaze. He hadn't said much since Richard had taken back control, and I caught a flash of resentment in his expression. Part of me wanted to call him out, to remind everyone how different things could have been if my advice had been heeded earlier. But I let it go. This wasn't about Kevin or about settling old scores. It was about doing right by the family, about building something solid for the future. Later, as I helped clear the table, Richard pulled me aside, his voice low and sincere. I know I've said it before, he began, but I really am sorry for how I treated you. I let my biases and pride get in the way. I was wrong, and I hope you can forgive me. Looking at him, I realized how far we'd come, not just in repairing a portfolio but in changing hearts and minds. Thank you, Richard, I replied quietly. That means more than you know. Let's move forward together this time. In that moment, standing in the kitchen amid the clatter of dishes and laughter from the dining room, I finally felt seen. I understood that real respect isn't given. It's earned through perseverance, integrity, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's hard. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time I believed we could face it, not as adversaries but as a family united by trust and shared purpose. I looked at Richard, feeling a flicker of surprise at the sincerity in his voice. For so long our conversations had been laced with tension or awkward politeness, but there was a warmth now that caught me off guard. "Thank you, Richard," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "That really does mean a lot to me. And I want you to know, I'm not carrying any old grudges. I just want us to keep moving forward together." He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I noticed his features relax. A small, almost imperceptible softening, as if he was finally letting down a guard he hadn't known he'd been holding up. "You have my full support from now on. I trust you to handle things," he said, and I heard the unspoken relief in his tone. Hearing those words was like having a weight lifted from my chest, a heaviness I'd carried for years, built from every time I'd been overlooked or underestimated. For so much of my life I'd been fighting for recognition, craving that someone, especially Richard, would see past the labels of gender and family ties, and just see me for my work, my dedication, my vision. Now, for the first time, it felt like I wasn't fighting anymore. It wasn't because I'd outmaneuvered him or won some argument. It was because Richard had changed, and with that change, he finally saw me as I truly was. The months that followed brought a new sense of order and purpose. With Richard's genuine support, I stepped fully into managing the family portfolio. It wasn't simply about undoing Kevin's errors anymore, though that was the immediate task. I wanted to create something sustainable, resilient, a portfolio built to weather uncertainty, to not just recover but to thrive no matter what challenges arose. I threw myself into research, late-night strategy sessions, and calls with experts. I diversified our holdings, balanced risk, and set up systems to monitor progress more closely than ever before. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was deeply satisfying, and slowly, the numbers began to reflect the effort. Within half a year we saw steady improvement. No overnight miracles, but a real, measurable comeback. True to his promise, Richard didn't hover or second-guess me. Instead, he adopted a new role, that of a thoughtful advisor, asking insightful questions and occasionally offering praise that felt earned and meaningful. The man who once dismissed my opinions with a shrug or a frown now listened with genuine interest, sometimes even deferring to my judgment. There was a humility in him that hadn't been there before, and it made me realize that respect was just the beginning. He was learning to trust, and that trust was the real foundation we'd been missing. One evening, as we sat in his living room surrounded by spreadsheets and quarterly reports, Richard leaned back in his chair, a look of reflection on his face. "You know, Sandra," he began, "I used to think I had all the answers. I thought I understood people, business, this family. But this past year, it's taught me that sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who end up teaching you the most. I'm grateful for that lesson." I put the report aside and met his gaze, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. "It's never too late to learn, Richard," I said, my voice steady with newfound confidence. He smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and nodded. "You've done more for this family than I could ever put into words. Thank you, Sandra. Truly." In that moment, I realized I'd found the closure I never even knew I needed. For years, my drive had been fueled by the urge to prove myself, to earn the acknowledgement I'd been denied. Now that drive transformed. It was no longer about validation from others, but about recognizing my own worth, standing tall in it regardless of who else saw it. Beyond the family, my professional life blossomed in ways I hadn't dared hope for. The turnaround of the family's portfolio didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues and clients alike began to reach out, asking for advice or inviting me to collaborate. The recognition I received at the awards gala was just the tip of the iceberg. With every new opportunity, I felt myself growing into the career I'd always envisioned, not simply as an extension of my family, but as a leader in my own right. At home, my relationship with Richard evolved further. He became an ally not just in business, but in the daily rhythms of life. He asked about my day, offered support when I faced new challenges, and even encouraged me to take time for myself, something he'd never thought to suggest before. The old friction between us gave way to a partnership built on real respect and shared goals. We both knew the past couldn't be erased, but now, the hope for the future outweighed any lingering regret. Looking back, I realized that this journey had given me more than just professional success or family harmony. It had taught me that you can't force people to see your value. All you can do is show up consistently, do your best work, and let the results speak for themselves. Recognition, when it finally arrives, isn't about the apology you once craved. It's about standing in the truth that you were always enough, even when others couldn't see it. That night, as I left Richard's house and walked into the quiet evening, I felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that comes from knowing you've done the hard work, both within and without. The future was still uncertain, with challenges I couldn't yet predict. But one thing was certain: I had finally claimed my place, not just in the family, but in my own life on my own terms. And that, I realized, was the truest victory of all.